Good, you're back. I'm Neom, and today we're talking about the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist. As I have in some of my previous videos, I will inevitably find a way to make fun of the French. See if you can find the strategically placed French roast within the video, and comment when you do. We begin in the great nation of Canada, and I must warn you that this story will likely be the most Canadian story you've ever heard, and is not for the faint of heart. Oh, Canada. Land of hockey, the Royal Canadian Mounties, that nasty gravy french fry thing that looks like compost, and most importantly, the FPAQ. FPAQ is the acronym for this dumb French term, which translates as Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. Maybe you've heard of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It is a collective of oil-producing nations from Africa, South America, and the Middle East, whose mission it is to coordinate and unify petroleum policies to stabilize oil markets, ensure a steady supply of oil, and regulate the price of barrels among member nations. Or maybe you've heard of the Sinaloa Cartel, who does basically the exact same thing, only with drugs. The FPAQ is basically Quebec's government-sanctioned maple syrup cartel, which controls 72 to 77% of the world's maple syrup supply. I told you this would be gut-wrenchingly Canadian. All major producers of maple syrup in the region of Quebec, which includes about 7,400 producers across more than 13,000 farms, are required not only to be members of the FPAQ, but can also be forced, as involuntary members, to contribute up to 25% of their product to the ISR. What is the ISR? It stands for the International Strategic Reserve, which houses up to 133 million pounds, or 218,000 barrels, of maple syrup at a given time, essentially making it the Canadian Fort Knox. This melted gold gastronome was historically housed between 3 different facilities in Quebec. In 2011, however, there was a massive syrupian surplus, leading the FPAQ to temporarily rent a 4th facility just down the road in St. Louis de Blandford. Because this was not meant to be a permanent setup, the St. Louis location had been outfitted with very minimal security, even for syrup storage.
France is dumb, and the Eiffel Tower is overrated.
There were no cameras, no alarm systems, and a very limited number of guards. Now let me introduce Richard Vallieres. Richard was a notorious barrel roller, someone who sells or helps facilitate the sale of black market maple syrup. You could definitely say that old Rich had sticky fingers. In 2007, he was fined to the tune of $1.8 million and had his home seized by Canada's maple syrup branch of the government, your friendly neighborhood FPAQ, which must have really put a smile on his tap hole because he never let go of his grudge against them. And when he heard of the minimal security temporary warehouse containing 10 million pounds of the good stuff, he began plotting his great revenge. Being the notorious barrel roller that he was, Vallieres was very well connected in the syrup community. Sebastian Hutrus, who was a mule, a runner for black market syrup, introduced Richard Vallieres to Avik Caron, the husband of one of the owners of the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse, who was able to procure him access to the facility. Over the course of several months, Vallieres and at least 26 known associates were able to steal 9,571 barrels of syrup, whereupon Sebastian Hutrus would transport them to a remote sugar shack. The barrels would be tediously siphoned into new containers, refilled with water, and shipped back to the warehouse to be placed back where they belonged, although apparently they got lazy and eventually just stopped refilling the barrels. All in all, the gang made out with nearly 3,000 tons of maple syrup, worth over $18 million. It wasn't until July of the next year that FPAQ realized anything was wrong. Inspectors were performing an inventory when they realized that many of the barrels were lighter than they should be, and some seemed to be completely empty. They would come to learn that over 60% of the contents of the stockpile had gone missing. Thorough investigation led the police to a black market distributor named Etienne St. Pierre, who they ultimately traced back to Richard Vallieres. Vallieres was convicted of fraud, trafficking, and theft and was sentenced to 8 years in prison along with a $9.4 million fine. And what was called by some to be a miniature Canadian Cold War, a huge national upset, and a dire threat to a precious Canadian resource, was barely noticed by anyone else. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe for more, ring the bell, and comment what you want to learn about next. I'm Neom, and I'll see you next time.